from beginning to end. I've used this book. It's called 30 Days to Understanding the Bible as a way to guide us through. It splits it up into different eras. Last week I had 10 copies of this book, and people all took them. I bought another 25 copies. They're back there by Aaron in the sound booth in Hal. So if you'd like a copy, you're welcome to it. They're $17, and if you just want to put it in the plate, if you can't afford it and you still want a book, just go ahead and take one, because I'd like you to follow through if you'd like to learn more about how to memorize all these eras. Now, somebody asked me, are you going to keep repeating over and over all these eras every single Sunday? And the answer is yes. Because I've learned from God, because God repeats over and over in the Bible different stories, that's how we learn. So the very first era in the Bible is the era of anyone? Creation, the era of creation. And the main human in the Bible is who? In the era of creation is who? Adam. And this takes place in the Garden of Eden. Wonderful. So that's going to take us. Adam and Eve, remember, they fall into sin, they get kicked out of the garden, and sin just keeps on piling and piling until God says, all right, let's start from scratch, except for Noah and his family. So then there's a flood, and then the flood subsides, and God puts the covenant in the sky with a rainbow and says, I'm not going to do this again. And God gives Noah 2 commands: to be fruitful, to multiply, and to go forth. Noah's good at multiplication, his family is, but not so good at going forth, so they stick around. And then they start to get themselves, they like themselves, they're really, really good, so they decide to build a monument, that we call that the Tower of Babel. And God says, I'm going to put an end to this because this is idolatry. You people think that you're God. And he confuses the languages, and so at the end of chapter 11, the people have finally dispersed. So we move from the era of creation to the next era, the era of the patriarchs, the era of the, we did this on Father's Day, the era of the patriarchs, the era of, I just want to hear more of you, that's all I'm asking. The era of the patriarchs. Oh, good. Who is the first patriarch? Abraham. Who was the first patriarch? Abraham. Good. And he and Sarah have a son. Remember, they're up in their 80s. And when Sarah hears that she's going to have a son, she starts to what? Laugh. And so their first son, his name is Laughter. And in Hebrew, his name is Isaac. Who was the first? Who was the first patriarch? Abraham. And next? Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah, they have a pair of twins. Esau, the hairy one, comes out first, but the trickster holds on to his heel. His name is who? Jacob, the trickster. Right there. For those of you who don't know, his name is Jacob, and yes, he is a trickster. All right. So we have Jacob, and Jacob then, so the first patriarch is, and next is, and next is Jacob, and Jacob has a bunch of kids, but 12 sons. We call them the tribes of Israel. He had a favorite, and very good. And Joseph is how we get from the land of Canaan to the land of Egypt. Remember, there's a famine in the land. Joseph was already sold into slavery, and so that's how he gets over into Egypt. Eventually, his whole family comes over because they're starving as well, and so they are in Egypt when we close the book of Genesis. Now, if I asked you last week to take the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, that thin page between the two, do you remember how many years was represented by that page? 400 years. So we go to the book of Exodus. The people, God's people, are in the land of Egypt. And for 400 years, things were going well for a while, and then all of a sudden they became slaves. And God comes to Moses. Now remember, Moses, for 40 years of his life, he grew up as an Egyptian pretty much. Remember, his mom floated him down the river, but was pretty strategic about it. And so it was picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter then raised Moses up in the palace. Then Moses decides to take the law into his own hands and kills an Egyptian. And so he gets banished. So that 40 years, and then he gets married out in the wilderness, and then he sees a vision. Well, it's not really a vision. He actually sees this thing. He sees a bush that burns but doesn't get burnt up. So he goes up to find out what it is, And it's God, and God says, Moses, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go back to Egypt. I'd like you to go to the king, and I'd just like you to go ahead and just go to the king and say, I want you to let God's people go. And Moses says, no. Moses says, well, he does know he's arguing with God, so he makes up excuses. Nobody does this anymore, but Moses makes up some excuses. God finally convinces Moses that he needs to go. So he does. He takes his brother, and they go to Egypt. And there he goes to the king. Remember, there's some plagues. Finally, the king relents and lets the people go. And then they get to the Red Sea. The Pharaoh comes, and so God parts the Red Sea so Moses and the people of Israel can walk across. The Red Sea then closes in on the Egyptian army. And then you think that things are going to go great from there, but they don't. Keep reading the book of Exodus. Actually, the first 5 books we believe were written by Moses. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you were a Jew, you would call that the Pentateuch. Penta means 5, the books of the law. So Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments. He sees the people they're not behaving. So eventually what happens is that God says, straighten them out. Let's keep walking. They go to the edge of the promised land, the southern tip of the promised land. They send in some spies. They send in 12. 10 come back and say, man, it's really, really nice over there, but you should see the people who live there. They're huge. There's no way we can defeat those folks. 2 of the spies came back with the same information, but instead of saying there's no way, they said, those people are huge, but God is huger. So we can do it. Those 2 spies, one of them was Joshua. Majority ruled. They wander around in the wilderness for how many years? 40 years. And so we are now at the edge of the promised land. We are in the east bank of the Jordan River at flood stage. And God says to Moses, Moses, you are not going over. You can see it, but you are not going to the promised land. Instead, I have chosen Joshua to take the people. And Moses, you are going to die without placing your foot in the promised land. Now, Joshua, in Hebrew, we would pronounce it Yeshua, and we're going to hear that name again in the New Testament, and we're going to call him Jesus. The name Joshua in Hebrew means God saves. So Joshua has been told by God, all right, Joshua, what I want you to do is I want you to listen to me always, and you, Joshua, will take the land back from whoever is inhabiting it now. So I want you to defeat all the peoples in there, and you will repossess the land for me, for God's people. So the first thing that God does says this to Joshua. I love this one. All right, he says, Joshua, what I want you to do is I want you to get the Ark of the Covenant. How many of you have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark before? Some of you have. Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay, so the Ark of the Covenant is a real thing in the Bible. Really, it is. So it's a wooden box that's covered with gold, and on top of that box, so there's a lid that lifts off, and on that lid are there 2 cherubims, so these angels with their wingspans over there. And so it was believed that wherever the Ark was, that's where God was. So it's all covered in gold, and nobody can touch it. So they have these rings, these doohickeys that are on both sides of the ark. And so you would slide these 2 poles, which are also covered with gold. You would slide the poles into to the doohickeys, these, well, whatever they're called, the round things. And you'd slide them in there. And so nobody would touch the ark, just the poles. And then you would get just the priest to lift up the ark. And then you would carry it forth. Now, the Bible says that wherever the ark goes, God would go. And so there was nothing that could defeat them in terms of the ark. Now, some people got this crazy idea that it was actually the ark that was doing all this. It wasn't the ark, it was God. But in any case, here's what was in the ark. We know that the tablets, the Ten Commandments, they were in the ark. We know that there was still some manna that was left over that was put in the ark. And we know that Aaron's rod, Aaron is Moses' brother, and he had this rod, this staff that budded into almonds, and so that also was put in the ark. And so those things are what's in there. But God, whenever people saw that, they went, God is present, God is with us. So Joshua says, all right, get the Levites, have them pick up the ark, remember not to touch it, and I want you to go to the edge of the Jordan River. Now remember, the Jordan River is at flood stage. Now the Jordan River is generally not a big river at all. If you saw it, you'd probably go, well, that's a little tiny trickle. What big deal? But at flood stage, have you ever been in a river where it's been at flood stage, right? Have we had any examples in the recent history? Anybody? Yeah. Okay. So here we are, we're at flood stage. Now, are you supposed to cross a river at flood stage ever? No? Have you not been listening to the news? Good night. I don't know.
If you see a river, if you see water flowing over, do not cross it with your car.
How many people cross it with their cars? God's people hasn't changed a lot. So, this is what God says to Joshua. When the priest touch the river will stop flowing and you'll be able to cross over. Now, the people of Israel, they've kind of learned their lessons. Well, first of all, they've been wandering around the desert for 40 years. And they've heard the stories. They've heard about how their moms and dads had crossed over the Red Sea when God had stopped that. And then they also heard about what happened when people forgot about them, that God was preparing and providing for every way. And that's why they had to wander around in the stupid desert for 40 years. So they have decided to be quiet. Now, I'm sure there are some people who are going, you're going to let the priests do what? You're going to have them touch the river and it's just going to go, like, stop? Yeah, like that's going to happen. So, but it did. Now, we know Jericho is still around. We know that back when that happened, there was likely an earthquake. Now, with the Red Sea, remember, split in part. The Jordan River is just going to be dammed up downstream about 20 miles. And so from archaeological records, we can tell that there was likely an earthquake that happened. So maybe God used an earthquake to stop the Jordan River. We don't know. But even if God did, his timing is amazing. Can you imagine the priests? And first of all, priests, they're not always on time. And and so once they step into the river, the river stops flowing. Cool. So the people cross over, and of course, once the ark is done, then the river starts flowing again. And then God comes to Joshua and says this: Joshua, you are going to be our military leader, and you are going to conquer this whole nation. And the first thing that we need to do is, we're here at Jericho. Now, Jericho is a big walled-up city. There's people inside. And here's the plan. Here's our strategic military plan. I want you to take the people, and I want you to walk around the city every day 7 times. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to sing. You don't have to sing on key, anything like that. Just walk around the city. And then on the 7th day, I want you to walk around the city 7 times, and then I want you to shout and blow the trumpets, and the walls will come tumbling down. Now, I want you to imagine that you are hearing this from Joshua. Joshua's standing in front of you saying, okay, people, this is what God has said. We're going to take this city, and we're just going to walk around it, and on day 7, we're going to shout. Yeah, this is what's happening. I can tell you this because they look at Joshua and they do just what you did, and some nervous laughter until the other one said, shut up. They go, and then they had parking lot conversations after that. Do you all know what parking lot conversations are? If you're in the church, you should know what these are. So if you're in a committee in the church, and especially if it's a pastor who says something, we are going to try this, and the other thing. And in the committee, everybody goes, And then they get out in the parking lot, and this is what happens.
What does he think he's doing? Does he know about that?
See, I like to have the meetings in the winter time. It really limits the parking lot conversations. Well, whatever the parking lot conversations were, God let them go. And so they circled the city. And remember, the seventh day, they shouted, and the walls came tumbling down. And from there, what Joshua did was, well, he did what God told him to do. He goes right through the whole nation, divides it in half, this divide and conquer thing. So he goes from the Jordan River on the east side, and he goes all the way to the Mediterranean on the west side, and divides the nation in half. And from there, then they continued to conquer all the peoples until every one of the tribes gets a parcel of land. Now remember, Israel's not that big. Think New Hampshire size, all right? So it's not that big. So think more in terms of counties than the nations. But there are 12 that gets divvied up. Now what happens is one of the tribes doesn't get anything. They don't get any land. And Joseph's tribe gets double the portion. So it's not called Joseph anymore. He gets his two of the sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They get each part of a land. So it gets divided up, and there is this tribe that doesn't get any land. Does anyone know what the tribe is called? The tribe of the kind of jeans that you wear? Levites. All right. Now I want to talk about the Levites for a moment. They're very important. The Levites are the priests. And so God says, all right, all the other tribes, you all got land, you all get these other things, but you have to provide for the priests. You have to provide for them for a place to live. You have to provide for what they eat. You have to provide for their entertainment. You provide for their cable television. You provide all that stuff. Oh, I can already hear some parking lot conversations going on. The Levites are the priest. Who's your favorite Levite? So, God says that everybody else's job is to take care of the Levites. I just want to hear you say that. Take care of the Levite. Oh, more with a little more vigor. Take care of the Levites. Wonderful. That's your job. Now, some of you I know are going to go in the parking lot and go, what is he? So I want you, if you're going to go in the parking lot later on and go, take care of the Levite, I'll take care of him. I want you to read the book of Hebrews today. Now, I've done this series at every congregation, but I've never done this before, so I'm going to let you in on a little secret. If you read the book of Hebrews, you'll find out who the Levites are now. Because every one of us is a priest. But you got to read the book of Hebrews. So anyway, so Joshua is told, God is speaking through Joshua and says, take care of the Levites. So everybody has this parcel of land. Joshua, through God, has divided and conquered the whole place. So the Canaanites, well, actually, they don't. Do you know what? Sometimes God's people don't do what God asks. Even then, they had just gone through walking across the Jordan River at flood stage. They had just seen the walls of Jericho tumble down at just a shout. They didn't have any cannons. They didn't have any tanks. And yet there are people who will grumble. Because some of them grumbled about what land they got. Has anyone ever been had to deal with after parents or a relative dies and then they have to decide where the estate's going to go? Have you ever been involved in that? And I'm sure in your family everything went smoothly. Oh, yes, you take that. Of course, that means much more to you than it does to us. And oh, of course, take the china. I think that should belong in your family. And then there's a parking lot conversation afterwards.
What does she mean, taking that piece of china? She never did one thing.
Oh, sorry. God's people are a lot like they were back then. Because, friends, we are God's people. Now, if you'll read carefully, you'll find in the book of Joshua that some of the people, they didn't like the land that they were told that they were going to get. And so they said, I'd rather have the land over there on that side of the river instead of that land. Some of the land that some people got was like after they got there, they didn't take care of it. It doesn't happen anymore, but it did back then. and so it was taken over by somebody else. It's all in there. Have you noticed that what happens back then continues to happen today? So what does the book of Joshua speak to us today? Well, for me, it's important to recognize that it begins at the Jordan River. Here's this big river flowing down, and the people are afraid to cross over. And God provides a way for them to get across. And they walk all the way across, and they're walking. And they get to the Mediterranean Sea. And there's an even bigger body of water, and God doesn't tell them to go across the Mediterranean Sea yet. See, he's going to invite us to go to all the world. But right then, he says, no, you need to stop. And water is involved in all those things. If you notice, water can get into everything. Ask little Maya. Here, I'm all wet. You'll notice the carpet is wet up here. And in a while, it'll evaporate, right? And it will just hang here. And if you have any containers outside, last night it rained, right? Now, it doesn't make any difference what kind of container, that water finds a way to find through. How many of you have leaky roofs? Or wet basements? Yeah. God is like water and will fill us up as a vessel. If we're open to it, he'll fill us right up. If you're not so open, God still finds ways to creak into the cracks. You see, the Spirit is always at work, friends. It's my prayer that you remember that God conquers in all kinds of ways, and he's still in the conquering business. And God's people said, amen. Let's stand and sing together.